Good afternoon or morning, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome in. My name is Dr. Rachel Pertel, and I am a research associate at the National Communication Association National Office in Washington, D.C. I'm thrilled to welcome you all today to today's public program titled Caring and Communicating, the Role of Family in Times of Need. This event is part of NCA's broader effort to foster dialogue, promote diversity, and provide expert insights into important topics that impact communication practices and scholarship. Through our public programs, we aim to engage a wide audience, from students to professionals, in discussions that not only highlight key research, but also encourage best practices in and beyond the field. After a successful resurgence of our public programming schedule back last fall with our Power of Dissent event, I'm especially excited to be here with all of you today as we dive into today's topic. And we'll explore with experts the crucial role of family communication and effective caregiving. Before we dive in, though, I do want to read a brief land acknowledgement, which can also be found on our website, natcom.org. NCA would like to acknowledge the land that the National Office in Washington, D.C. resides on is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Nechonte and Piscataway people. NCA acknowledges that it is often gathered upon unceded lands and that those gatherings manifested the exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the grave harm that colonialism brought to these lands, in particular the erasure of both Indigenous and African identities via slavery and via racist laws and practices that segregated all peoples into binary classifications of white and Black. This acknowledgement demonstrates our commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Thank you. We have an excellent lineup of speakers today who will be sharing their research and perspectives with us. Today's public program will be formatted as a roundtable interview, where I will be asking our lineup of experts the questions that you all submitted and came here for answers today. I will direct each question towards one of our panelists in particular, but you may see the rest of them chime in or add on to what the first person provides. Kory Floyd is a professor and chair of the Department of Human Development at Washington State University, where he focuses on the mental and physical health benefits of affectionate communication and close relationships. He is also a licensed mental health counselor in the state of Arizona. Thank you so much for being here with us, Dr. Floyd. Afifi is a professor and chair of the Department of Communication at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She studies how family members communicate when they are stressed and its impact on their personal and relational health. She also examines how and why people disclose or avoid talking about sensitive information with close others, including their family members. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Afifi. Chevrette is a researcher and educator who works as an associate professor at Middle Tennessee State University. Her current memoir and documentary project positions family secrets about her father's sexuality and suicide within larger rhetorical landscapes to address how LGBTQ+ stigma haunts individual, familial, and cultural memory. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Chevrette. Oops. Sorry, everybody. Amanda Cooper is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Connecticut. She studies communication and relationships and family caregiving with a special focus on dementia caregiving. Thank you so much for being here as well, Dr. Cooper. I'll be moderating today's program and helping field open-ended questions at the end, so please feel free to drop any questions in the chat that come to mind during the presentation, or feel free to save them to the end and use Zoom's raise hand feature when prompted. All righty, let's get started. First question goes to Kory. Families often deal with multiple crises at once. How can they prioritize communication and decision-making when overwhelmed? What communication-based coping strategies can families use to navigate ongoing uncertainty?
Thank you so much for having all of us here today. We're delighted to be with you and talk about this really important topic of families and caregiving. When families are overwhelmed, one piece of advice that I often give them is to prioritize their most urgent needs first. So really to think mindfully about what needs attention right now and what can wait. And for so many of us, the experience of being overwhelmed is partly the feeling that everything needs attention right now. Nothing can wait, but that's rarely actually true. So we have to think deliberately, we have to think mindfully about what can be set aside and where does my attention need to be right away. I then encourage what is called solution-focused talk. When we think about communication strategies, often when we're dealing with problems, this is true at the individual level as well as at the family level, we tend to focus on what causes those problems, almost to the exclusion of what we would actually like to be better in our life. But solution-focused talk doesn't provide a lot of attention to the causes. It just asks the question, what needs to be better than it is right now? And how can we make that happen? Focus on the solution rather than necessarily the intricacies of the problem. And then finally, in times of crisis, I think it's really important to stay nimble, be flexible. A crisis is going to change day to day, sometimes hour by hour. And to be adaptable to that crisis, we need to maintain a mindset of flexibility that I'm going to roll with however plans change, however priorities change. I'm going to try to be responsive to that instead of coming up with a focus and sort of sticking to that plan regardless of how things unfold.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Anyone else want to jump in before we move to the next question?
I think adding on to what Kory is saying, one thing that helps a lot of people is understanding what they have control over, right? So sometimes when things are really uncertain, we can get easily flustered and begin to mull and ruminate about all the awful things that are happening and how, and then we just go down this deep, this dark rabbit hole. But I think focusing on the things that you can control and letting go of some of the things that you can't control gives people a sense that they can do it, that they can tackle those things. And, like Kory was saying, I think prioritizing, what can you tackle first, and tackling some of the easier things first gives people a sense of efficacy. And then tackling, the bigger things as they garner more confidence is also helpful.
Thanks so much. All right, this second question is going to Sage. What are some ways that families can de-escalate communication breakdowns in real time?
I always tell my undergrads about the importance of how we communicate to de escalate a conflict by giving a very simple example, focusing on my chosen family. So I give them an example. I say, say that I am at a party with my partner and they are out talking to all these other people, and I feel kind of ignored. Not that this has ever happened, but when we get home, I say, I felt ignored at the party. And they say, "What? I didn't mean to ignore you. Like, I thought you were fine talking to people." And then I'm like, "Well, no, I felt ignored." And I repeat myself to them because they haven't actually confirmed what I said to them. So I always teach this basically to undergrads in terms of the need for a response that validates what the person said. And that doesn't mean that you agree with them. It doesn't even mean that what they're saying is accurate, but that person, if they say to me, "Oh, okay, so I hear that you felt ignored," then I don't need to keep.
Oh no.
I wonder if we lost her.
We've
Frozen.
Yeah. Does anybody want to jump in? And hopefully she'll return to us. Oh, hi Sage. I think we lost you for a minute.
Oh
Would you
no, I'm on my school's network.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Would you mind repeating what you said after once you said that you have the other person affirm what you said and you no longer need to repeat yourself, I think that's when we lost you right after that.
Yeah, that essentially, this very simple example, I think, ties to a lot of conflict, and especially in families where we don't we're so caught up in defending ourselves or the perceived idea that we might have done something wrong that we never actually address the other person's concern. So that's one of the ways that I talk about de-escalating communication breakdowns. Essentially, it's really the bigger point is slowing down, right? To hear what the other person is saying, the other person or people. So that kind of reflective listening and communication within families. And then also, I suppose, as relates to kind of my focus on queer family communication and queering communication, is that the sort of idea of validating multiple truths, different identities that queer theory focuses us on, means that no one has to have the right story. Um, yeah, those are a few of my things. I'm sure others probably have some great strategies as well.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for sharing those with us. And sorry to ironically have you repeat yourself, but very grateful that we got you back. Anyone else have some tips they'd like to share?
I would just add, I loved what Sage said about like acknowledging the other person. I think, and slowing down. I think just taking time to let them know that, like, I hear you and I want to listen to you. Some of that, like, meta communication of, like, I want this to go well, but I don't know how to have it go well. When we're talking about difficult things that people have strong feelings about, often we don't know how to have that conversation the right way, but just saying something like, I care about our relationship and I want to try to have this conversation. I think that can also help bring down the temperature in the room a little bit and make space for a conversation where we might not end up on the same page. And that's okay, because the goal is no longer to convince one person or the other person about who's right, but just to make space to have the conversation and acknowledge that we don't know how to do it perfectly.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right. Throwing it over to Tammy now. How does an individualistic culture mindset create barriers to effective family caregiving? And what can be learned from collectivist cultures that emphasize communal caregiving versus individualistic cultures?
Yeah, thanks. I think, you know, and I was talking about this with my husband, who's also a professor, but and with our two friends who are professors because we're visiting their place. And so we've all been caregivers at some point. So I just posed this question to them because I wanted to hear their answer. But my husband comes from a very collectivistic Middle Eastern culture, and I come from more of an individualistic culture. And I think individualistic cultures, and we kind of all agreed on this response, there's kind of like uh, you're kind of in it on your own a little bit, in a sense that you kind of need to figure it out more on your own. Collectivistic cultures, you're almost born with the assumption in your family that you will be caregiving for your family members at some point, right? And to prepare for that moment. And you basically adjust everything in your life with the assumption that you will be caregiving for them. So you often, don't put a family member in a senior living community. You would care for them at home. And a lot of families, you'll have multiple generations living in the same household at various points throughout their career. Even like as young adults, there's often assumption that young adults live with their family members until they get married, for example. And so I think they often also tend to live around each other more often. And so it's easier for them to caregive kind of as a network. But I know with my husband and I, it gets a little bit more difficult because people are becoming more mobile. And so we were halfway across the country. And when his dad got sick, we actually left our jobs at UCSB and moved to Iowa to caregive for to caregive for his mom, actually, when she had dementia. And it wasn't even a really an overt conversation where it was like, hey, should we do this? It was just we just knew that that's what we had to do. And we always knew that at some point we would do that. But I think we also have to be careful not to make wide sweeping assumptions as well, because I think there's a myth that people think in individualistic cultures that people automatically want to put their family member in a nursing home, and research shows that that's actually not true. That family members want their loved ones to live at home as long as possible, and they want to make that happen. But they are more likely at some point more comfortable putting their family member in a senior living community. It's less stigmatized, right? And they also likely have more resources to be able to do that. So when we do research with senior living communities, we've did a senior living community study with 28 senior living communities, and 95% of them are white, right? And higher in socioeconomic status. So now we're doing more research in the community where we're working with more family members from collectivistic cultures. But there's just a different assumption about caregiving, that it's almost inherent as part of the norms in that culture. But we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But I wanted to open it up to see if anybody else had things they wanted to contribute.
Tammy, one thing I wonder about is the idea, the perception at times, and at times the accurate perception that I've reached a point in this person's journey when I no longer have the expertise to care for them at home. So I need to elicit the support of a care community or something like that, because they have, let's say, medical needs or psychosocial needs that cognitive needs maybe, that I just don't know how to address.
Right. Yeah, in fact, we face that in our own family where there becomes a point often, especially if they have dementia or another significant physical or mental cognitive challenge, where they might begin to fall, for example, and you can no longer pick them up yourself, or it becomes like a safety issue where it's actually maybe not in their best interest to live at home, or you become a nurse and you're like, I am not trained in this. I don't know how to do this. And so for my mother-in-law, she ended up in a senior living community for the last 3 months of her life, simply because it was a danger to her, because she had dementia and it was getting pretty severe. And I think this is where a lot of, for example, collectivistic cultures, their resources tend to be within their own family networks and in their own community. And they might be a little bit hesitant to reach out to the government, for additional information or in-home care services. Hopefully that's getting a little bit better, but it might mean that they have in-home care that comes in to assist. But I think it's then up to us to get them that information, and access to that information to help them also caregive at home when it becomes really difficult. But Alice has a question.
Hi, sorry. I just find the conversation really interesting, and I actually just taught that in 2 of my classes this morning. I think also what you said, it's not just the perception and the orientation within the culture, but what complicates it, I think, is that within literature, people tend to give moral qualities to this cultural orientation that have actually nothing inherently moral or good or bad about the individualistic and the collectivistic choice. And just because the social structure and certain societies operate within those, I think what further complicates, and I think with the question what creates additional barriers, is the fact that once an individual makes that choice, whether it is to put an individual, like their parents, into a senior living community, or to actually care for them at home, I think the pressures from that society
Yes.
become actually what creates that additional complication, because you might be perfectly okay with that, choice, but because
Yes.
then these cultural values, this cultural orientation are given moral quality, they make you either the bad guy, or you're, the senior, and like he wants, in that condition. I think that's when it becomes an issue, when
Yes.
cultural orientation become issues of being good or bad, when they actually have nothing to do with morality. I just wanted to add that because I think it
Yeah.
complicates the conversation.
I love that. And because of that sense of morality, there might not actually be the spaces in those communities where your loved one can go. And there's also, yes, a lot of pressure involved in that, and a lot of guilt involved in that, including from the family member themselves, right? That it's like your duty, your obligation, right? But you're like, this is not actually good for the person because we're not able to provide the type of care that they need. Yeah, thank you for that. That's really important.
Yeah, thanks so much for jumping in, Ella. Aside for that awesome contribution, anyone
Uh,
else have anything to add?
yeah, I wanted to address something kind of different, but inspired by this conversation, that thinking about family caregiving, and how the individualistic mindset can sometimes get in the way, or what I'm thinking of specifically is that we often think of caregiving specifically in like end of life issues, and experiences, but there are other times across the life cycle, obviously, that we're in need of care. And one of the places that the family like doesn't always feel that for individuals is, so I teach in Tennessee, but I'm sure this is true across the US in different places. And essentially, I have at least one student every year who's been cut off from their families because they are trans. Often that is the case. Or if they are gay or lesbian, sometimes they are still in the closet to their families. And essentially, that means that the family doesn't actually provide the care that young adults, or college age students need at that time of life. And so I was actually thinking as I listened to the ways that community and including potentially educators might have to step in to fill some caregiving gaps for LGBT individuals, especially across the life
Right.
cycle.
Well, I think our organizations in the United States anyway, are more individualistic, where they don't think about the moments in your life when you need to provide care, and when you might need to step away from work for months or a year and take a leave, and how do you um, help that person, and allow them to enter back into the workforce without the shame. And if your child has a baby, or if you are caregiving for a family member if they're ill, right? Providing the flexibility of working remotely or taking time off from work, and coming to their aid is really important. But I think we make it harder on people to do that. And so having that flexibility is really important in the workplace.
Great, thank you all so much. I'm going to go to the next question unless there are any objections. Good. So now we're going over to Amanda. What role does family communication play in making difficult medical decisions, particularly when opinions differ? Great segue. What are the most common financial and or legal stressors for family caregivers, and how can they be mitigated?
Thanks, Rachel. Well, I think to the first part of that question, communication within the family is often central to making these decisions. So, even in a relatively individualistic society, once we get to especially really severe medical conditions where the person can't always make choices for themselves, usually it goes to the family to make decisions. And so, conversation among family members and decision making becomes really critical. And what we find often is that family members often fall back into their normal patterns of communication in these stressful times. I think going to what Kory was talking about earlier, I think when we're feeling overwhelmed by the moment, we kind of go to our defaults. And so the patterns of communication that have been established in families are really important during this decision making time. Um, just the ways that they're able to make decisions together or not often come out during these kind of difficult medical decision making times. To the second question about financial and legal stressors, I think these are some of the stressors that make it so difficult when it comes time to make medical decisions. You know, if you all of a sudden have medical power of attorney and you weren't planning on that, right, because your loved one is not conscious, maybe in a medical situation, that can be a lot to handle. Caregivers also and families in general often incur really great financial barriers and burdens because of medical care. So I think that just adds to and complicates the decision making and the conversations. And I think one of the big things that really helps in these situations is advanced planning. So having conversations long before anyone is sick or long before anyone has an illness about what is going to happen. Is there an assumption about who's going to provide care? Does everyone agree on what that assumption is? Who's going to have medical power of attorney? Who's maybe going to be in charge of finances for mom and dad when they're starting to get old and maybe aren't able to care for themselves as they did before? So having these conversations in advance, I think, is something really important for taking the pressure off of these difficult medical decisions, because a lot of those decisions have been made or at least discussed previously. Um, I think also advanced planning helps with the financial side of it. Planning for retirement is a thing that you don't think about as much in your 20s, but then once you're in your 50s, you should be really planning and you might not have as much time to prepare. So you won't have as much time to prepare. So I think recognizing that all of us will come to a crisis point in our health or in our families, there's going to be something that will happen eventually. And as much as we can have these conversations early, they're often awkward. They can be difficult conversations to have, but having a conversation about, who's going to take care of mom and dad, what kind of care do they want, where is the money going to come from? Do we have the resources to care for our parents or for ourselves as we age and as we get near the end of our lives? I think that advanced planning and having conversations in advance is really important.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Anyone have anything to add?
I'll jump in. I was kind of having this conversation this morning with Waleed because in one of my responses for one of the next questions, I also agree that any advanced planning is like ideal where you actually like sit down and like talk these things through. And of course, Waleed was like, well, what if in a lot of cultures are what we would call high context, right? Where they don't overtly talk about things. And it can be kind of like, well, you should know what the family member wants so that you don't have to actually overtly talk about it. He's like, well, what do you do in that situation where the family is more high context or like a little bit more avoidant in that sense that you should just understand the relationships well enough to know? And my response is, well, it doesn't mean that you even have to, for example, overtly talk about it with that person right away. You could talk about it with their partner, and then talk about it with your siblings, and then eventually approach the topic with that person as well to make sure that that is like what they want. But you can also start to plan things and engage in actions that are less overt, but it's still, there probably needs to be some level of a conversation. I think it's how you approach it and approaching it sensitively. But I don't know, Amanda, like if you have like other ways that what you'd recommend.
Oh, it's such a tough question. I mean, I think I like the idea of having conversations that are sensitive to the fact that it can be uncomfortable. And I think even if that means having small conversations along the way instead of like sitting them down and saying, we're going to
Yeah.
talk about what's the plan,
Yeah,
right? Like
right.
you can have that conversation.
Little bits when you're gardening or when you're taking a walk, like bits and pieces here and there.
Exactly. Like when I was growing up, my mom and I would always wash the dishes together when I got home from school. Somehow that was like a thing we did. And so like we would just talk about all kinds of things. And I think when you start talking about all kinds of things, that creates space for talking about like what's important for you, like maybe the conversation is, like what happens after we die and what do you want to have happen beforehand, right? Like what, like wherever that conversation can be open for you. Or I think another opening to the conversation, at least in my family, has been when my parents started providing care for their parents. And so we'd have this conversation like, whoosh, this was tough. Like, do you want this too? Like, would you like this kind of care? So I think finding ways to ask the questions, maybe in bite-sized pieces, is a good idea. And then also, I think sometimes just an open acknowledgement that, like, okay, this is kind of an awkward question, but like, can I ask you? Or I've been thinking about this. But I like that idea of having small questions along the way. And I do think it's so easy as a communication researcher to be like, the best practice is to have these conversations, but then not always to think about like, oh, this is a hard conversation to have. It can be hard to approach.
I mean, for me, it's like maybe it's just because I am a little bit more like low context, but with any sensitive topic, I think the more you can talk about those sensitive topics as a parent, from when your children are young, all the way through the lifespan, then they don't become stigmatized. We've already had many conversations with our kids who are now in college, even when they were little, just about like end of life type of things. And sometimes we infuse a lot of humor to kind of just make it so that it's really not a big deal. But that can also be an interesting way to do it.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think too, media can play a role in bringing up conversations. So, a good friend of mine was just telling me about a book that she read and her mom read, and then it opened the door to have conversations about end of life care. I'm like, oh, that's awesome, or there's some really great movies or media that portray what it can be like to walk this path, and I think sometimes those can be good conversation starters as well.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. We ready to move on to the next question? Cool. Back to Sage now. How do LGBTQ plus individuals and chosen families navigate caregiving differently than more traditional family structures? What resources and policy changes are needed to better support non-traditional caregivers?
I think I'll actually speak to my previous comment a little bit in the way I addressed this question at first, because I was thinking about we have a student in our communication program here at MTSU actually who is retired and has already had a successful career as a lawyer and is taking classes now. And she is very involved with our LGBT student group on campus. And I think I have a lot of respect for her because I know that her involvement is very, very deliberate. And so I was thinking about that, how essentially she is stepping in to provide a kind of caregiving relational role for young people who she knows may have issues with their families or be estranged because of political relationships here in Tennessee. And so, anyway, that just came to my mind as an extension of my previous comment that to a certain extent, we have to think about caregiving and when caregiving is needed slightly differently when we're thinking about marginalized communities who face different kinds of struggles. Thinking of my own family, who I grew up in a very sort of queer family, even though that was a secret. Like it was the 80s, and, people were closeted or just didn't talk about things. But my mom was actually the executor on two of her friends, like, estates end of life. And so, of course, that's flipping then from like the care young people need to the end of life care. Essentially, people outside of biological families end up filling roles oftentimes for LGBT folks. And that may be folks who didn't have children as well, right? Like, I don't have any kids, and so I can't by default assume that there will be a child attending to my end of life care. And then, of course, in terms of policy, we lack the resources and policy to support those non-biological kin relationships in many cases, right? So that would need to change. But I think the other thing I would add is that caregiving across kind of chosen family networks can also look different in terms of whether it's providing actual care in times of illness or death. And again, like my mom being the hospice, the person who was there in hospice when her um, best friend was dying, because there were no other family members, but also kind of along the life course, making sure to do the check ins on people who are outside of just your biological kin communities. And I think that's true for everybody, like LGBT or not, that we can all play a sort of enhanced role in how people deal with times of trauma and need for care that may look especially different for minoritized groups. And I think this is also true with topics of mental health, with topics of suicide, which my current project is looking at. That we need to essentially caregiving isn't just logistical kind of structural supports, it's also like a communicative practice.
Can I also just add on? I love Sage the thinking about caring across the lifespan as being something that we do throughout life and supporting each other. I also have been thinking about policy changes that would be helpful. And I think one of the things that when I talk to caregivers, they are just exhausted. Like so often, they are just exhausted and they don't feel like they have time to take a shower or like go buy groceries or some of these really basic things. And so although I think caring is something that we do relationally for sure, I think there is a space for policy to create structures of support as well. And one thing I've thought of is just making respite care or in-home help more available. I think would be a huge help for particularly people who don't have a family structure built in to provide care so they can get some paid care or some professional care, but also for those family and other social networks that are providing care to give them some space to breathe. I think it's really challenging to be a caregiver, and so if we had some structural support to create to provide funding for or to create opportunities for some of that respite care or home-based care, I think that would be really helpful for caregivers.
Agreed. Agreed. Thank you both so much. I'm going to move on to the next question, unless anyone wants to add anything else. Okay, back to Kory again. How can families navigate difficult conversations about death, dying, and end of life care in a way that honors everyone's needs? What are the key factors that help families process grief and maintain connection after the loss of a loved one?
Thank you. I'm certainly not an expert in grief, but I'm going to do my best um, to do right by this question. And I want to sort of address it first from the perspective of when a death is imminent in the family, and then talk about grieving after that loss. Amanda was talking in great detail about the conversations that often accompany when somebody's nearing the end of life, about medical choices, care, things of that nature. And those are all really important to have and necessary for decision making. What I would add to that is also conversation about the person's values. And Amanda alluded to this in her answer as well. Asking the person, what matters to you the most in your final days? And it doesn't necessarily have to happen when that loss is imminent. I had this conversation with my parents a couple of years ago about, as they near the end of their lives, what matters to them most about the way that they're going to spend their remaining time, focusing on their values in addition to what's important for them in terms of their medical and legal considerations. And then I think respecting that autonomy, really sort of centering the wishes of the person who is nearing the end of life, and at the same time honoring difference among the people who are involved in that loss. So that's the caregivers, the family members, the extended family, the chosen family, the friends. They may all have unique wishes or fears or beliefs about that loss. And so creating space for all of those voices to be heard, I think, is really valuable. After a loss has occurred, something that I often would help counseling clients with is the idea that everyone grieves in their own way. And it's very useful to honor that as well. For some people, grief may bring up a lot of sadness. For others, it may bring up a lot of anger. It may bring a sense of relief that the person isn't suffering anymore. So there's going to be a range of emotion, and all of these can happen within the individual as well as across. So creating space, holding space for that diversity in the way that we grieve, I think, is really constructive when families are going through a loss. Something that a number of communication scholars have written about is the importance of family rituals. And maintaining family rituals can be a really significant way of honoring the memory of the person who's been lost. I think about sharing family stories in particular is a way of sort of keeping that person alive through their memory. They continue to be a part of our lives when we talk about them, when we remember them in that way. And then finally, I would just add that it's important to think about seeking outside support. It's great to be able to go to family members for support when we need it, and to friends and to our close allies. It's also important to remember that not everyone is equipped to provide us the support that we need, sort of alluding back to our earlier conversation about managed care. The same way is true when we talk about mental health. Family members and friends are great because they know us, they know our history, they care about us, and also a counselor, a therapist can be great because they don't necessarily know our history, and also because they have tools that a family member or friend may not have to help us be able to process in a constructive and a generative way. So just being open to that, I think those are among the things that I would say with respect to this question.
Great. Thank you so much, Kory. I thought you did a great job, for the record. Anyone else have anything to add?
I actually have a question. um, for Kory or anybody. I'm curious. So, right now I'm working on essentially like queer family secrets and silence and stigma. And in terms of the kind of importance of sharing stories and memories as a way of grieving, how do you think that this could be improved around stigmatized loss?
Mm.
So, for example, suicide. We lost a colleague several years ago to suicide now. And I think you see similar processes as you might see within like a stigmatized loss within a family. Are there ways that we can improve storytelling despite silence or stigma?
That's a complicated question, but my mind goes back to what Tammy was talking about a minute ago when she was describing starting conversations, especially sensitive conversations early in life with her children. What kept coming to my mind as she was telling that story is that you're normalizing it. You're sort of helping to take the stigma, the sensitivity out of it, and meta communicate that it is okay for us to talk about these things, that they don't need to be stigmatized. Now, I say that in full recognition that the reality is much more complex than that, and there can be repercussions for trying to normalize something that is stigmatized within a certain speech community. But I think of stigma as one of those factors that only has the power that we give it, that we continue to give it. And when we continue to shy away from talking about the tough parts, let's say in our memory of a colleague who has passed away, when we shy away from talking about those tough parts, we're just reinforcing the idea that it should be stigmatized, that we shouldn't talk about those things. And, sometimes we just have to be brave and say, I'm going to try to at least take one tiny step toward normalizing this, toward making it at least a little bit more comfortable for us to talk about. So that's a really simple answer to a really complicated question, but it's always where my mind goes. Stigma only has the power that we give it. Sage, I think you may still be muted, but
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
yeah, I saw you giving me the nonverbal affirmation, so I appreciate it.
Agreed. Thank you both. Moving on, back to Tammy. How do social factors such as race, gender, and socioeconomic status shape the caregiving experiences? Are there unique challenges that marginalized caregivers face when accessing support systems or resources? I know we've touched on this kind of a lot throughout this conversation, but any more that you want to say?
I mean, yeah, all of it. It's huge. I don't know, like it can't be understated. We talk about, in our scholarship, the notion of intersectionality, right? That race is intersected with gender, that they often cross together. And I also have studied economic hardship in different ways for a while, and I feel very strongly that we shouldn't analyze it as a variable, that to me, economic hardship crosses everything a person could experience, right? So if you're struggling financially, it affects every aspect of your health, it affects what you think about every day. And that penetrates into the caregiving experience, right? So marginalized caregivers are probably also like experiencing unique financial challenges that make it just exponentially more difficult. One of the things that we hear from caregivers all the time, and I think Amanda, you said this as well, the financial burden is truly unreal. And they often don't even realize it until it's too late and they're in it. And they're like, oh my God, like nobody told me how horrible this is. That they, for example, often have to bankrupt, like the family member with dementia, for example, um, in order to get any type of an assistance. And once you're labeled with dementia, for example, It's unlike what you would think. You actually don't get more help, you get less help from the government. And just being able to like get in-home care, you think that would be somewhat more affordable than a senior living community, but it's not. It can be, $120,000 a year to provide in-home care. And so, and I think a lot of families that are on the margins and like struggling financially, they're working multiple jobs, struggling to make ends meet, and then this happens, right? So they're already struggling in many ways just to keep food on the table and just to be able to survive. And this can really be for many families like a tipping point when you have a family member who gets cancer or is ill in another way. Um, and then what we often see in our research a lot is the trauma from your childhood, unresolved feelings of hurt, favoritism from years ago, enter into the family caregiving experience. And so if a lot of that stuff isn't dealt with, it really can affect how people provide care, and can really be very harmful, to the person who's receiving the care, but also in those relationships they can become even more toxic 30 years later when they're attempting to caregive. And a lot of this is gendered still, where, for example, if someone needs to give up their career to provide care, it's often women that feel the pressure to do that. And I think we even saw that very overtly during COVID when, parents had to provide the education for their children at home. Women were more likely to be the ones to leave their career. But it's also a luxury to be able to leave your career, right? So in a lot of families, they're just not sleeping. And they're juggling with multiple people to try and do this patchwork care the best that they can. But it also is harming their physical and mental health, long term. And we know that that takes a toll on the caregiver, who's more likely to die sooner, because they're just simply exhausted. So I don't know. I'd love to hear from anybody else in the Zoom who has experience with this, who has insights or something else they'd like to offer as well. But yeah, it's really important.
Yeah, Tammy, I think everything you've said was just totally right on and really reflects what I hear when I talk to caregivers as well. I think the piece about intersectionality with gender and race and culture and socioeconomic status, I think what happens is the people who are at those intersections tend to be hit the hardest. And often I talk to women who are caregivers who feel like I'm the only person who could do, like, no one else is here, so I'm the one that's providing care, or I'm all my siblings put this on me. Like, so often it feels like there's not a choice in caregiving for individuals who are at these intersections. And then also going to your point about socioeconomic status, that I think so often those individuals end up providing care beyond the point of what is safe or what they're capable of doing because they don't have the financial resources to get
Yeah.
additional help. And so then I think, like you said, that puts both the person receiving care and the caregiver at risk, and they're in a really difficult situation, but they don't often feel like they have resources to help them do any other type of caregiving or get any assistance. So it's really, really a difficult, I think, and really an economic issue. When you were talking about economics, I thought, oh, that's really, really true to what I see and what I've heard.
And it really is a public health crisis, where as people age, they're living longer, they're going to need more care. But we also are in such a bad economic situation where people have to work, to be able to survive. And so who is left at the end of the day to caregive? It often is a very piecemeal kind of thing, and something has to give. And so it's often certain people in the family that have given kind of throughout the life course to give again. And a lot of people are parenting their children in the sandwich generation and caregiving at the same time. Um, and then marriages also suffer, because they're the last thing that you have space for often, which we
Right.
know, isn't good, right? And we need to be able to invest in those. And some people are single parents, and that's even more difficult. But yeah,
Yeah, it's
sorry to
just
be so dark about this. you know?
I think that's why, though, I think it's so important that we have these conversations because I think there are supports that could be given. There are structural
Yes.
changes that could happen. Like, there's things we could do
Yes.
as a society that would build structures of support to help, across the strata. It would help everyone, but particularly people who are at these intersections, who kind of have the compounding difficulty and the compounding stressors that
Yes.
manage to provide care.
Absolutely.
Thank you both. Just to keep us aware of time, we have about 6 questions left in about 30 minutes, and we do hope to open up for Q&A at the end. So just raising some awareness around that. But now we're going back to Amanda. How can families adapt when a loved one's personality or behavior shifts due to illness or treatment, or when they resist or deny a diagnosis entirely?
I just want to start by saying this is really, really difficult and happens to a lot of people. I think, we're talking about difficult things already, but it can be incredibly challenging for someone that you love and that you know well and that you know what to expect from to all of a sudden have them behave differently. I hear this so frequently from caregivers who have the sense of like, that person that I knew is gone. Like they're not that person anymore. They're doing things that they would have never done. They're sometimes saying hurtful things they would have never said. And it can be incredibly difficult and incredibly painful to navigate changes when your loved one's personality shifts or their behavior shifts. One of the things that I've found in my research that is helpful is for people to be able to make a sort of a mental shift separating the illness or the disease from the person, and to be able to make this shift to put the blame for some of the hard and difficult behaviors onto the illness. So I should clarify, I specifically studied dementia and Alzheimer's caregiving. And what I found is the caregivers who are able to say, dementia is saying these things. My mother is loving and wonderful and kind, but dementia makes her say things that are really hurtful, or dementia motivates this behavior that's very frustrating. When they're able to kind of make a shift rather than just being angry at the person for behaving in the way that they're behaving, that seems to create space for caregivers then to approach the situation with a little bit more patience and compassion for the person who is experiencing the illness or the cognitive decline. Um, Another thing I think that is helpful for families who are trying to navigate these shifts in personality and behavior changes is to draw back on things that they've always done. So I loved Kory talked about family rituals and routines. I think drawing back on some of those rituals and routines, and specifically what you know about the person and who they've always been, can help you kind of craft solutions and ways to relate and continue to have a relationship even as that person maybe shifts or loses some of their cognitive abilities. So, if you always made cookies together at the holidays, like do that. You might have to shift what that looks like. Maybe instead of them leading, you lead. Maybe they're rolling out the dough instead of using the oven, right? Like there might be some shifts in how you engage in a certain family ritual or behavior, but finding ways to continue to enact your relationship as much as you can and adapting those rituals so you can continue to engage with them, I think is a thing that can help families maintain a sense of connection even as their loved one shifts and changes with the diagnosis. And then I'll also just say, like, seeking help when needed. So recognizing that if a loved one or a family member is because dementia and some other illnesses can cause behaviors that are aggressive or really challenging, recognizing that it's okay to ask for help, and that your safety and the safety of your loved one, probably it's a first priority, and something that it's okay to seek support from other people, especially when you're navigating these difficult behavioral changes.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Going back to Sage again now. How can families, shifting topics a little bit here, but how can families have meaningful conversations across political divides without alienating one another? What strategies can family members use to address issues like stigma, stereotyping, and wokeness in a way that fosters understanding, even when there are differences, especially in this particularly divisive time?
I'll start my response here with a joke I heard from a stand up comedian who said, "Great line whenever someone says something that is politically very out there, at least from your perspective, is, 'Can you believe that?'" Okay, but seriously, I think of this in kind of a both and way. And this topic certainly comes up in classes that I teach, including this semester. I have a class called Rhetoric and the Racialized Other. And so essentially, what I mean by both and is like going back to my de escalation and communication breakdown comments earlier. Like, yes, listening, validating, all of those good communication practices are certainly ones that you can bring into play here. And especially, although this can be difficult to do for people whose identities are under or feel like they're under attack from stigma, stereotyping, or political rhetoric. But if we want to make an impact on others, including family members who sometimes might be like more logically within our sphere of influence than people who are further from us. And if we want to make an impact on them, we're not going to do that by invalidating them or saying, "You're stupid, you're wrong, you're an idiot." Why would you think that? So, um, I think that is important, but I also always like to give sort of credence to and reminder that the stakes are not equal for everyone. So, a lot of advice that frames like dialogue as the solution for politically divisive issues. Dialogue privileges those who are in dominant positions and whose communication itself is already read as polite. Whereas if you're bringing up taboo topics or stigmatized topics, you're the one who's likely to be viewed as being impolite in the first place. And so it's not a level playing field exactly. So sometimes for marginalized family members, alienation is actually a survival strategy, right? A refusal to keep re explaining yourself or your position or your humanity in environments that feel unsafe. So I always like to kind of, like I said, both and that it's important to communicate where we can and also recognize that sometimes we can't or it's better not to. But going back to, I mentioned a class I'm teaching right now, and I really like there's Professor John Powell, who frames their work, I think maybe a sociologist, if I'm remembering correctly, but they frame their work around belonging and othering. And I really like this kind of framing. And they basically talk about also creating conditions where people, or as it relates to this question, like political perspectives, aren't excluded or diminished like in a structural way. That when we talk about like belonging, otherness, or division, political division, we're not just talking about beliefs, we're not just talking about identities, we're talking about structures and what supports people have. So I like that perspective as well.
Thank you so much, Sage. I got one more each for Tammy, Kory, and Amanda, then a question for everybody, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So, Tammy, what are some concrete techniques that families can use to build resilience in the face of adversity? How can families create a sense of stability when external circumstances feel unpredictable? And what are the pitfalls of our current understanding of things like stability and resilience?
Yeah, I'm going to keep this quick because I want to leave some time for Q&A. But I think family is our greatest resource. Sometimes it depends. You're creating your own family, so this includes fictive kin, right? It might not be your family um, by birth or origin or whatever, but it's turning toward people who give you comfort and give you a sense of security and help build your collective efficacy. So I think doing things with a sense of community, finding your community, it could just be friends in the local community, but pulling toward each other can give you that sense of solidarity. I think, as someone who's studied resilience for years, it's a double-edged sword, right? So yes, we at some level all want to be resilient, but I think we need to be careful to try and also change the structures that are often flawed, that can force people to try and be resilient in ways that might be harmful instead of fixing the underlying structural things that can do damage, especially to communities that are more marginalized or oppressed. So I think fighting back in ways, saying no, we're not going to take that, resisting certain language that can be harmful, like my husband is Palestinian, and so that's been a big source of, I think, emphasis for us, is pushing back against the master narratives of erasure when there's an ongoing genocide, like things like that. And so just know what you stand for, what you believe in, and finding your community, right? And kind of resisting things that can feel harmful or make you feel less than or uncomfortable. So, and I think everybody just needs to find that space. So that's what I would say. And I think having a team mentality for like caregiving, like working as a team and finding out what people are good at. Like everybody has different skills. And so if someone is caregiving from a distance, including them, what can they do from a distance that makes them feel good about their caregiving experience, and capitalizing on people's strengths and really kind of building each other up as a team is important. So that's it.
Thank you so much for those recommendations and insights, Tammy. I'm going to have to send talk to my family. Kory, what are some key steps that families can take to begin healing after estrangement or to rebuild trust when past communication has been damaging and harmful?
So many of us have gone through this, and there's lots and lots that can be said about it, but I'm going to keep my answer brief. Start small. We don't undo what is sometimes years of estrangement and conflict overnight. So I recommend beginning with a low stakes interaction. It could be a call, a note, a brief visit, just to reestablish contact before tackling the larger issues. I think it's in that initial conversation, it's really important also to avoid blame. And that's a very difficult thing to do when you feel like someone has wronged you. It doesn't mean you don't talk about your conflict, but talk about how each person experienced the conflict instead of debating who was right. And to the extent that you're able to offer responsibility, take responsibility for the role that you played, offering apologies without excuses. It's difficult to do at times, but it can really further a relational repair. And then I think focusing on the present and the future, it's important not to lose sight of the past, of course, but that's not what you're trying to fix. You want to fix your future. You want to have a future that's more positive than the past has been. So create positive memories, share a meal, start a new tradition, have new experiences together that can begin to form the basis of a relationship moving forward, recognizing that you're both different people now than you may have been when the estrangement started. So I'll stop there, but those are some concrete things.
Thanks so much for that, Kory. Also, great recommendations. And Amanda, many caregivers are overburdened and may not see academic research, as relevant to their experience. How can researchers effectively engage this population? And what ethical considerations should researchers keep in mind when studying caregivers, particularly those navigating intense personal hardship?
Sorry, trouble unmuting. I love this question because I feel like this is a question I'm always asking myself. One thing I think that is important is go where the caregivers are. So, sometimes I think that means partnering. Actually, often I think that means partnering with organizations that are already in contact with caregivers. I've tried to work alongside the Alzheimer's Association and other care offering organizations in my community, and that's been the best way for me to be able to get in contact with caregivers. I also look for things like podcasts or newsletters, things that are going to go to caregivers, where they're going to see the research that I'm doing. And then the other thing that I think is really key is to make sure we're speaking their language. So I think it's really easy as a researcher to speak research language and not to speak like regular person language. So I find that I often have to remind myself, like, I want to put whatever I'm doing research wise into as simple language as possible and as digestible bite-sized pieces as possible. So things like creating an infographic or doing like a very brief little like summary blog post of what you're doing rather than when I first started, I would send people my research articles. I'm like, oh no, no one wants to read your research article. It's beautiful. I want everyone to read it. But really, what I want them to have are the tools and the research findings. And so putting those into really bite sized, concrete recommendations and bite sized, concrete forms of presentation, I think are really important. Um, then to the second piece, just briefly, ethical considerations. I think we have to recognize the sacrifice of time and emotional investment that's required when you're doing research with some of these populations, and as much as possible, trying to be respectful of that. So I try to design my research to be accessible to them whenever they have time for it or wherever they could call in from. I try to think about if I'm able to, giving something back for their time. So I like to give something financial if I'm able, but also trying to feed back the research findings and concrete recommendations to those populations, and trying to invest back into any systems that are already established to help support them.
Great. Thank you so much for that great advice. This is our last question, but I'm thinking maybe we skip this one in the interest of time and open the floor for Q&A unless anyone feels strongly about commenting on interdisciplinary collaboration. Cool. So thank you everyone so much who submitted these questions that we used to develop this interview, and to all of our speakers for their insightful answers. I know I certainly learned a lot from the past hour and a half. But we'll now begin our open-ended Q&A session. So if you have questions for our panelists, please feel free to share them in the chat, or you can use Zoom's raise hand feature, and I will field your excellent questions. And I'm going to stop the screen share so we can all see each other. Got a question in the chat. What advice would you give for people who are caregivers themselves?
So one thing, I'm not sure if that question was caregiving for themselves or caregiving themselves for others, but
You're right. I'm sorry. It was caregivers for themselves. Thank you.
no worries. I was like, I'm not sure if I read that quite
No, it does
quickly
me.
correctly, but I think there's really something to be said for building a network of supportive people around you. So, Sage has talked about this like in multiple ways across this discussion, but I think finding people that you can call on, whether that's, if you're having a difficult day, whether that's if you need some tangible support, finding the people who validate you and will support you. And then to Kory's comment, also seeking professional help when needed. So I think there's no shame in seeking therapy or seeking a paid caregiver if you need physical care that you're not able to provide for yourself. So being willing to ask for help, I think, is an important piece.
Great, thank you. And I think Cassidy, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you all for sharing with us your insights and having this great conversation. My question is just what directions would you all like to see family communication scholarship or our field go in to better address family caregiving as a whole? So any areas you think are understudied or underaddressed or just really important, interesting directions you're all moving?
I mean, I guess I'll start by answering that. I would like to see us go into more, well, we do need more basic research to understand from families' own experiences. I especially think caregiving in marginalized communities is understudied still in our field. I also, once we understand that, I would like to see more interventions. But it's hard for us to jump into interventions without fully understanding. So the past 9 years, I've been working with a VR company, working with older adults with dementia and their caregivers who live at a distance. And we did a couple of like NIH like clinical trials with senior living communities, but now we're going into the home, hopefully, and taking VR into the home and making it free for people because I do want to reach people in the home because it's just a different demographic. And it's where a lot of people really reside. And I would love to focus also on like providing respite for caregivers. Having been someone who's been a caregiver, it's really difficult to be in that space and have a job and be parenting and caregive at the same time and having tools at your fingertips that are free for everybody, that anybody can access. Because at some point, you often run out of tools. You're like, I don't know what else to do that's free that, would be really good to help my family member thrive. Because when someone has dementia, we kind of write them off as if their life is over. But they should be able to thrive in ways that they still have a very full life. And how can you do that in ways that are easily accessible? So that's kind of what I've been working on.
Thank you, Tammy. Anyone else want to add to that question?
I'll add, I love what Tammy said about interventions and finding resources that are easily accessible. I love that. Definitely, I think an area we have room to grow in. I think, as far as like basic research, another area that would be good to continue to explore is the more of a broader family systems approach to what happens with caregiving. So we often look at one member of the family or maybe two, and it's more difficult to look at more than that, but trying to understand the broader family systems perspective and what happens within the communication in the family as a whole, as a unit, rather than these discrete pieces that I think we have a lot of information about lots of the discrete pieces, but less about how the whole thing works together as a family system.
Thank you for that.
My quick addition is just something that I'm working on right now. Is an article relating to adverse childhood experiences and essentially recognizing the way that these can accumulate and continue to affect communication, and communication within families. So I don't really have the answers yet or ever, but it is a very interesting thing to look at. And I think understudied when we think of things like traumatic experience as being discrete related to a particular event, when really it builds across the lifespan. So that even my mother, who is elderly and who I've learned some things by participating in this panel, some helpful things. But like my father's suicide 30 years ago, and her silence around it actually still is central to the family dynamic and to her communication or lack thereof now as she's old. So it's really interesting to me.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I think we have time for one more question. If anyone wants to jump in with anything else to ask.
Sure. See, see myself. Hello. I don't see myself on the screen, but I don't know. Are you
We
able to?
see you.
We can
Okay,
hear
great.
you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I'd like to ask a question about the role communication research, or specifically family communication research, plays in the interdisciplinary nature of caregiving. Research is a lot of times are working with people or scholars, experts coming from other fields or disciplines. And I want to ask the panelists, what do you think is the most important thing that we as communication scholars could contribute to the research in caregiving? Thank you.
I'm going to jump in here because this is actually what I intended to say in response to our last shared question, which is that when we're working in an interdisciplinary space, one thing that we as communication scholars can offer in that conversation is the idea of communication as a core skill that cuts across everything else that we do socially. And so think about the kinds of models and principles that emerge out of our field that we can share, things like shared decision making models that maybe come out of small group communication, or narrative approaches, conflict management strategies. These are things that are really central to our field and yet are relevant no matter what we're doing socially. And in my own experience, I found that even though we sort of take these things for granted, they're often seen as revelatory.
Yes.
Like, oh, we just never thought about that. And I'm like, well, we think about it all the time. So that's something that I think we can easily provide, sort of going back to our core competencies as communicators.
Yeah, I definitely echo that 100%. Like with my grant work with our interdisciplinary team, and like I just go back to what I've always been doing for the last almost 30 years, which is observational coding of actual communication between people. And I seem like a dinosaur sometimes because I'm like, yeah, I'm still doing that, and yep, I'm still looking at multiple family members because I go back to like the core of what I love, like a systems approach, the complexity of families. And often our samples are really small. That's because we're going in deep into the core of a family system. And we do human coding. We do computerized coding, of their kinesics and their facial expressions. But we're doing things that other people are like, oh, wow, like you can do that. Like you do that. And they don't really know how to code human behavior. But we're going back to the stuff we've been doing for decades, the Judy Burgoon stuff or whatever, but using it in a way that can actually help families and help design interventions to improve people's health.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. With that, I'm going to close out the Q&A. But before you go, we do want to, first of all, thank you again to our excellent speakers for sharing your expertise and perspectives today. Um, And I would also like to thank our audience for attending and for engaging and giving us such great questions. And before we conclude, I want to ask you all for just one more thing. Please kindly take a moment to fill out our feedback survey. You can access it by scanning the QR code on the left-hand side of the screen, clicking on the link in the chat, or through the email that we will send after this event, which will also include the resources from this event. Those resources include a tip sheet on evidence-based strategies for supporting mental health for caregivers from Kory, a working manuscript on a developing theory of rhythmic synergy to depict the dynamic process of communication and sense making that caregivers experience when caring for a family member living with dementia, which includes practical components for readers from Tammy, an abbreviated guide to disrupting stigma, engaging in queer care and queering family communication from Sage, and an infographic on communicating with a family who has dementia from Amanda. Your feedback is invaluable at helping us improve future programs, and we wanted to make sure you all did not leave this program empty-handed as well, at least other than the awesome knowledge that you have all gained. So our speakers have kindly taken the time to create each of their own take-home resource for you all based on their subject matter expertise. So we hope that these resources will provide guidance and comfort as you navigate communication with your loved ones during hard times. Again, these resources, the link to them were dropped in the chat, and I will also provide that link in a follow-up email, and they can also be downloaded from the QR code on the right-hand side of your screen. And that is it. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
And we look forward to seeing you at our next public program. More information about NCA and our public programs can be found on our website at natcom.org. But thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your week.